Welcome back to Radio Merdog, and tonight we'll be taking a look at a northern dwelling monster, one that has really stricken fear into the hearts and minds of many native peoples for hundreds of years. This creature is a cannibalistic monster possessed by a malevolent spirit with an insatiable hunger and a desire to commit murder and eat other humans. Tonight, we'll be doing a deep dive into the Wendigo. It comes from the traditions of Algonquian-speaking peoples, mainly the Cree, Ojibwe, Innu, and the other tribes found throughout the northern United States and Canada. The Wendigo are generally strongly associated with the north, winter, cold, famine, and starvation. So pretty broad concepts, but they play a big role in how the character is developed over the years. And it really all starts with the creation. And the creation of the Wendigo happens when a person, usually driven by starvation or utter desperation, the irredeemable sin of cannibalism. When that taboo is broken, the person becomes something twisted, something that can never be full ever again. Once a person has began to go through the Wendigo transformation, they undergo a series of horrible bodily changes. They become gaunt to the point of emaciation, with their desiccated skin pulled tightly over their bones, with their bones pushing against their skin, with a complexion of an ashy gray, and their eyes pushed back deep into their sockets. They look just like a gaunt skeleton, recently disinterred from the grave. And whatever lips they had are now tattered and bloody, unclean, and suffering from the suppuration of flesh, and they would give off a strange and eerie odor of decay, decomposition, and moral corruption. In Ojibwe, Eastern Cree, Swampy Cree, Naskapi, and Innu lore, the Wendigos are generally described as giants that are many times larger than human beings. And it is interesting. This is a characteristic not really seen in the Algonquin cultures, but it is quite prevalent in the aforementioned ones. And whenever a Wendigo ate another person, it would basically grow in proportion to the meal it had just eaten, so it would never be full. So then the idea is that it's just perpetually growing, never able to satiate their hunger, but yet they grow stronger and more powerful. However, they will still keep that gaunt stature. So, therefore, they are generally portrayed as simultaneously gluttonous and extremely thin due to their starvation. They are truly seen as the embodiment of gluttony, greed, and excess, never satisfied after killing and consuming one person, and they're constantly on the hunt for new victims. And even when going through this transformation, they don't necessarily lose their human abilities of cognition and speech. And some reports have them clearly communicating with their prospective victims, even threatening or taunting them. And within the Assiniboine, Cree, and Ojibwe tribes, it's kind of interesting. They have this satirical, ceremonial dance that they would sometimes perform during times of extreme famine. And this would basically just be done to reinforce the seriousness of the Wendigo spirit possession. And when they did this, they would wear masks and dance backwards around a drum as a way of warding off the Wendigo spirit. The last known time that they did this ceremony was, of course, at Lake Wendigo at the Leech Lake Reservation up in northern Minnesota. That kind of spooked me a little bit when I found out that it was done at Leech Lake, because I've been through there quite a few times on my way to go up hunting in northern Minnesota. I mean, most of my family hails from northern Minnesota, so I've spent a good amount of time up there, especially growing up. And I usually go up pretty far north and hunt for deer most years in the fall time. And it really is such a cool atmosphere to be in, when it's just snowy out, freezing cold and dark. It is a totally surreal space. I mean, it's so quiet. There's a stillness, and especially with the snow just dampening sounds, it's pretty easy to feel lonely and isolated out there, even if you're not really that far away from civilization or other people. And I can only imagine what it's like hundreds of miles further north, up in Canada or Alaska, where a lot of these tribes would inhabit, especially hundreds or even thousands of years ago. I can imagine there was an overwhelming fear of somebody being possessed by the Wendigo spirit, whether it be through greed, anger, loneliness, like a just desire to destroy, or a combination of all of that. Somebody possessed by the spirit could decimate the overall sanity of a family group, or just even the whole tribe. It's pretty bad stuff. And this idea of being consumed by that greed gets us into the concept of Wendigo psychosis. And Wendigo psychosis is what many of these historical accounts of people encountering the Wendigo have been retroactively diagnosed as. You know, when they've been reported to have been possessed by the Wendigo spirit after being in a situation of needing food and having no other choice besides cannibalism. And sometimes they do have the ability to get food, but they still resort to cannibalism, and we'll get into one of those reports a little later on. But first off, here's a pretty famous one from 1661 that says this. This is, quote, "What caused us greater concern was the news that met us upon entering the lake, namely, that the men deputed by our conductor for the purpose of summoning the nations to the North Sea and assigning them a rendezvous where they were to await our coming, had met their death the previous winter in a very strange manner. Those poor men, according to the report given us, were seized with an ailment unknown to us, but not very unusual among the people we were seeking. They are afflicted with neither lunacy, hypochondria, nor frenzy, but have a combination of all of these species of disease, which affects their imaginations and causes them a more than canine hunger. This makes them so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men, like veritable werewolves, and devour them voraciously, without being able to appease or glut their appetite, ever seeking fresh prey, and the more greedily, the more they eat. This ailment attacked our deputies, and as death is the sole remedy among those simple people for checking such acts of murder, they were slain in order to stay the course of their madness," unquote. So, like, damn. This was a very real thing that affected many, many people throughout First Nations history. And although in a lot of the reported cases of Wendigo psychosis, the person was killed who was, dealing with the psychosis, to prevent any more cannibalism, especially within the Cree folklore, they would sometimes try to treat the person that was afflicted by doing stuff like giving them fatty animal meats or drinking animal grease, and then supposedly they would sometimes vomit ice, and that would be a way of showing that they were being cured, because a whole part of the spirit possession is the idea that it kind of chills your heart and makes you a heartless person. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Another famous case of Wendigo psychosis comes from a Cree trapper from Alberta named Swift Runner. And during the winter of 1878, Swift Runner and his family were severely starving. I mean, it was a brutal famine, and they were all facing death. And eventually his oldest son, he passed away from starvation. And this is where it gets really weird, is that even though Swift Runner and his family were only less than 25 miles away from emergency food supplies, he brutally butchered and ate his wife, and then killed his remaining 5 children and ate them. And because he still resorted to cannibalism, even when food supplies were so near, and he was fully aware of this, this is argued as being a true case of Wendigo psychosis. And whether or not Wendigo psychosis is the possession by a northern spiritual entity or some sort of neurological disorder has been something heavily debated for decades now. And in the case of Swift Runner, I mean, he was caught, of course, because he wasn't that far away from civilization, and confessed to his crimes, and then was swiftly executed in Saskatchewan. So, yeah, it's a pretty interesting case. I definitely recommend looking it up if you're interested in learning more about Wendigo psychosis. But another fascinating case involves an OG Cree chief, and he was also a medicine man named Jack Fiddler. And he became famous and well-renowned in the community for his ability to defeat Wendigos. So he was a Wendigo warrior. He was out there just murking people. I mean, this literally meant he was just killing people who were going through what he perceived as Wendigo psychosis. Well, he didn't perceive it as Wendigo psychosis. He just thought these dudes were Wendigos. But he did this so many times with his brother, Joseph, that in 1907, they were both arrested in Canada for homicide, because they were literally just murdering a lot of people. And Jack, he pretty quickly committed suicide, but his brother Joseph ended up with a life sentence, and yeah, he wasn't too stoked on that. But he eventually got a pardon, but then died 3 days later in jail before he even received the news, which, that just sucks. And it's kind of wild to me, just say it again, that these guys were just up there in Canada, just murdering people and claiming the people they killed were possessed by an evil cannibalistic spirit. But I guess, that's just what true dedication to faith looks like, I guess, in a way. Like, damn. There's been countless stories like these. The idea of Wendigo psychosis really kind of hit Western science in the mainstream in the 80s, especially a lot of psychologists and anthropologists started researching it. And a lot of them argued that Wendigo psychosis was just a total fabrication. It just wasn't a real thing. And it was really just the result of naive anthropologists taking stories related to them at face value without any further observation. However, a lot of others have pointed to numerous credible eyewitness reports, both by Algonquins and others, as evidence that Wendigo psychosis was a legit, factual, historical phenomenon. And it is worth noting, I think, that psychosis cases pretty sharply decreased in the 20th century in a pretty strong correlation with the Boreal Algonquin people. They just started coming into contact more and more with European ideologies and weren't living, they were living less nomadic and rural lifestyles. They weren't spending all of this time trekking through the woods and rural areas solely engrossed in their own folklore. Now they were interacting with Christian Europeans. And I think that's pretty interesting how once they got out of that environment, the amount of Wendigo cases pretty sharply declined. So, going forward a little bit, in a treatise written by James B. Waldron, who was a medical anthropologist, he stated that, quote, "No actual cases of Wendigo psychosis have ever been studied, and Lou Moreno's scathing critique in 1985 should have killed off the cannibal monster within the psychiatric annals. The Wendigo, however, continues to seek revenge for this attempted scholarly execution by periodically duping unsuspecting passerbys, like psychiatrists, that Wendigo psychosis not only exists, but that a psychiatrist could conceivably encounter a patient suffering from this disorder in his or her practice today. Wendigo psychosis may well be the most perfect example of the construction of an aboriginal mental disorder by the scholarly professions, and its persistence dramatically underscores how constructions of the aboriginal by these professions have, like Frankenstein's monster, taken a life on their own," unquote. So, yeah, like I said, a lot of people in the medical community did not believe it was a legit thing, and you can find a lot of reports of them saying stuff like that. So, going to the present now, in the ICD-10, which, if you didn't know, is basically just the book that classifies as mainly diseases and mental health problems and related health issues. It classifies the Wendigo as something called a culture-specific disorder, and it describes it as, quote, "rare, historic accounts of cannibalistic obsession. Symptoms include depression, homicidal or suicidal thoughts, and a delusional, compulsive wish to eat human flesh. Some controversial new studies question the syndrome's legitimacy, claiming cases were actually a product of hostile accusations invented to justify the victim's ostracism or execution," unquote. So that's Wendigo psychosis. Maybe it's a mental illness. Maybe it's a spirit possessing people to eat other dudes. Maybe it's all fake and just a way for deranged people to justify killing and or eating other humans, which I guess would be a mental illness, but But there is something that is verifiable, and that is the Wendigo as a concept or a metaphor in these native cultures. As a concept, the Wendigo can really apply to any person, idea, or movement that's been infected by just like a corrosive drive towards self-aggrandizing greed and excessive consumption. Greed and excessive consumption are some of the main points to this all. And these are all traits that they just sow disharmony and destruction if they're left unchecked, especially in a close, tight-knit tribe. And I mean, these are huge no-nos when they have to fully rely and trust on each other to simply survive on a day-to-day basis. So there's this Ojibwe scholar who's named Brady DeSanti, and he asserted that the Wendigo can be understood as a marker in a way, just a way to indicate a person imbalanced both internally and toward the larger community of human and spiritual beings around him. And once that equilibrium is gone, balance is gone, and people are estranged by their communities, people thought to be afflicted by the Wendigo spirit, they would just fall apart and tend to, in a way, destroy the natural balance around them. So the analogy of Wendigo possession is also used for other evil acts like rape and spiritual desecration. And Wendigos, they've also served as a sort of metaphor for explaining patterns of domination in societies, like when a group subjugates, dominates, or destroys another group. And some people argue that Wendigos are just agents of something called social cannibalism, who know nothing of provincial or national borders. I mean, it's a global issue. They say, people who argue for this say that all human cultures have been visited by shape-shifting Wendigos in their own way, and that these visitations, they sort of speak to the inseparability of the human experience. I mean, to these sorts of people, these creatures, national identity is irrelevant to this conceptual, borderless horror. I mean, it doesn't matter where you're from, what your nationality is. These people, these Wendigo-afflicted people, are everywhere. And this gets into the idea that Wendigos are really just an expression of the dark aspects of the human condition, the drive people have towards consumption, towards greed, and just a disregard for others in this megalomaniacal pursuit. It's just this cycle that just keeps on going, where they just take, and hurt other people. So to kind of put that all together, the Wendigo can be looked at as symbolically representing three major concepts: the incarnation of winter, the embodiment of hunger, and the personification of selfishness. Well, all right, that was a lot. That was a lot of the Wendigo's history and how it's looked at nowadays. And one other thing that I would like to touch on is how most of the modern interpretations of the Wendigo are a lot different than how they were before. And like I said before, in Algonquian lore, the creature was very humanoid in appearance because it was at one point a person. But it did look like somebody who has risen from the grave. I mean, their skin would be white or grayish. Their skin stretched tight with visible bones. They would look totally emaciated, be perpetually starving. Their teeth would look almost like fangs, like yellow and pointy, with long, sharpened nails for tearing into people's flesh. However, for whatever reason, nowadays, the Wendigo is generally depicted as this tall, deer-looking creature with big, the antlers of a stag, pretty much. But this version with the deer antlers has no real basis in any Native American folklore, and I've been trying to figure out where this comes from, this weird modern interpretation. And from what I can find, I think it started in the 2001 film just called Wendigo, and it was just a way to stylize it and make it stand out a bit more in the movie instead of just looking like a white, gray, dead guy walking, pretty much. So I think it's interesting to look at how in the modern day and over time these different myths evolve in a lot of different ways. And so you might be asking, like, is the Wendigo a cryptid? I don't think so. I think it falls more under the category of just folklore and legends. But, I mean, there have been modern sightings of it, mainly in northern Minnesota, Ontario, Alberta, Manitoba, and deep in Quebec. But usually these reports just consist of something tall moving between the trees. Usually it's moving faster than a human, or some say like a humanoid shape with antlers watching them, or I see a lot about inhuman screams coming from deep in the northern woods, and they attribute that to the Wendigo, even though that could be any number of things. I'd sooner believe it's a Sasquatch than a Wendigo screaming. I mean, I did read one report that described a creature so tall that it had to bend to fit between the pines, and that its breathing sounded like cold air being dragged through a broken flute, and that this strange, tall creature followed him for miles. But I don't know if that's necessarily a Wendigo. That could have been some other creature. I mean, there's a lot that supposedly live up in those northern regions, and it's pretty terrifying once you start looking into it, how much is really out there. So, personally, for the Wendigo, I think it's more of an idea. It's a symbol of a lot of things. I think it's a symbol of community and the importance of that, of morality, and why you need to have a strong moral and ethical code. It's a symbol of survival and how quickly we can fall into times where our survival may be at stake, and the danger of letting either literal or metaphorical hunger control your life. If you have that insatiable hunger for greed or to destroy, that can drive people to do evil things. And I think that's why the legend has endured for so long. It's not just your standard like campfire horror story about a creature in the woods. It brings up some pretty thought-provoking and meaningful ideas, I think. And that's kind of what's drawn me to this legend over the years. After all that, whether you think the Wendigo as a creature in the woods, or a spirit of hunger, maybe a moral warning, or just a straight-up cryptid stalking the northern tundra, I do implore you to keep the legend of the Wendigo in mind, especially if you find yourself out there in the deep woods on a cold, snowy night. I'd also advise you to not munch anybody out there. I don't think anything real good can come from that. So, this has been the Merdog with Radio Merdog. Thanks for listening. That's all I got for today. Peace.